Hello, welcome to this mini tutorial on how to create an animated texture using UV coordinates as this explains just in front of us. Before we get started, I'll try and keep things reasonably quick. I know that I can talk a lot, but just to explain the premise here is what we're doing is we're going to create basic textures and then we're going to use the UV coordinates to move that texture by using a very basic animation command and some keyframes. Luckily, this doesn't cost our CPU too much, and of course it's a really simple effect that can be applied and used in various use cases, whether it's to create, animated water, some moving textures in a background, or is it just to, create or simulate or pretend that it's some sort of useful texture on a skin. So it can be used in a wide number of use cases. And if you're ever looking for examples of this sort of thing, then I think there's plenty of computer games out there that still use animated UVs or panned textures in some regards to create the illusion of movement, especially things like liquid surfaces, lava, water, etc., etc. So hopefully in this example we'll go through things one at a time. So what I'll do is I'll get started by just explaining the scene a little bit. I'll probably just zoom out there and go, this is a very, very basic scene. We've got a background, some text, and of course you can see this is actually just a polygon plane where the texture is animated across it. And it's not doing anything too fancy. It's a very, very simple setup. So what we'll do is we'll start from the scratch and we'll use a water texture, which I'll bring on screen just now. Let me see if I can find that, of course. There we go. You should see this. This is a water texture, and it is taken from a very wonderful free source called pxfuel.com. And of course, I'll provide a link to that in the file as well, so that you can use the same one that I'm using if you wish to play along. So we'll get started, and I'll essentially get into the crux of this immediately. So let's close that. So first thing I'm going to do is just hide all the things that we don't need to see anymore. So first of all, this mesh type, I can Control H to hide that, and this mesh type I'll press Control H to hide that, of course. And like all things, I'll probably just start with a sphere just so we can get things started. So create polygon primitives, and we'll create a sphere to start with. And I'll press R for scale, and I'll scale that right up. Of course, this will be our sort of test ground. So I'll pop that up there, somewhere in the middle. And of course, everything's looking reasonably easy to do so far. So we'll begin this process by adding a simple material, of course. So I'm going to go to hold right click over my object and then scroll down to assign a new material. And of course here I've got a bunch of options, but to keep things reasonably simple for today, we're going to stick with the Lambert texture. So I'll make that larger so you can see what I'm selecting. So Lambert, of course, is our sort of default non-fancy material. It's very simple properties and we can't really get too confused. So I'm going to add that Lambert in. And of course, it will now have its own little tab over here in our attribute editor. Your attribute editor, of course, if it's not open already, you can access it by pressing this little sort of stacked view sign over here. Or, of course, you can press Control A at any point on your keyboard if you're looking for shortcuts. And of course, shortcuts are always useful for all sorts of reasons. So I'm going to scroll to Lambert, and of course my first principle of the day is usually to rename that immediately. So mat underscore, and we'll just call this test for now since it's a test. And of course, whenever I'm doing lots of little bits of testing, then if I know there's a test file, I know like our test node or test object or test material, I know that it's safe to delete that or hide it because I know that it's just a test, it's not a final thing. So I like lots of test files because this stuff can get complicated quickly. So to begin with, we'll take a look at how animating UVs works essentially. And the idea here is that we're essentially instructing Maya to move the coordinates of any given sort of texture or material instead of having to hand animate anything in particular. So it requires just a couple of bits and pieces before we do that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go over to my color area and I'll hit this little button here, of course, which is for assigning an input, or it's that little checker box. If we give that a click, then of course it'll ask us which render node that we're looking to create. Now we'll scroll this, and I think what we can do now is that we can either plug in our water texture or we can plug in something else if you really, really wished. Now, given the spirit of things, of course, I'll hit File. And File, of course, is where I want to browse to that water texture where I've saved that. So if I open this up, and then I head over, of course, to ART104. Then I've got my bite-sized tutorials area. And then I've got my simple animated textures tutorial. And then, of course, I've got my water texture pattern. So I'm going to open that immediately and hit that in. Now, of course, this will now, I haven't changed any of the UVs, anything. This is just the default UVs as created by Maya, and it has now wrapped that texture across the sphere. If you can't see that, of course, remember that you must have textures enabled. You can switch that on at the top of this little viewport bar here. So, of course, if I unclick that, we'll just get our standard sphere. Just tapping F there, sorry, to focus on that so it's central. And of course, by switching that off or on, I can enable or disable that. And be careful, I'm not using any lights. If I switch lights on, of course, I have no lights in my scene, so that would switch all of those off. Of course, you can access hardware shading, of course, from the shading menu as well, which is just down here. You can see that it's now ticked. Hopefully, anyway. So now, in any sort of, for all intents and purposes, now this is now an assigned texture. It's not doing anything particularly fancy. It is setting still. So how would we begin to move that? Now, in this particular case, we're going to use, essentially, it's a little bit of a hack. Now, there are probably more sensible ways of doing this that are probably a little bit more cost effective, but ultimately I'm all about getting results quickly so that we can get some very basic things done. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to instruct Maya to make sure that it moves this texture across our UV coordinates. Now, if you remember correctly, our UV coordinates were essentially a 2D layer of information that tells where Maya tells the model where an image belongs. So I'm going to open up that. So if I go to UV editor, just so we can take a quick look. And here we go. I'm just going to close that. I don't need my toolkit. So these are the UVs for this object. And of course, I can enable the image as well, just so you can see how that's construed. Here you can see this water image. If I deselect this, for instance, just to, well, obviously that's never going to work. But if I was to grab these UVs and move them, you can see how this works, this principle. Now, what we don't want to do is to manually have to sort of animate these UVs, but we can see that by moving those coordinates, it affects our object directly. I can also see that if I was to move it other directions, I can move it that way as well. So again, I get a very different effect. So knowing what you want is obviously very handy, but I just want this texture to pan down across this. So I'm going to ignore this for now because it's not something that I'm particularly interested in just yet. I can close that, and I want to just do something that's nice and simple in the meantime. Let me just disable soft selection there. Back to object mode. F for focus. So let's take a look at a couple of things here. So inside here, we know that color channel now has something plugged into it. Maya tells us this because it has this little input sign over here that has replaced the little checker box. So if I give that a click, of course, it takes us to a bunch of other properties that we can play with, including it tells us where the source file is. And it can tell us a bunch of things such as, if we look in these properties. And then we're going to ignore all of that. Instead, we're going to switch over to the other tab. And this other tab is a very different node. And this tab contains this place 2D texture information. Now, this is a node essentially that has all the sort of parameters that says this texture should be covering it on a one-to-one basis. And of course, there's other things we can play with here, such as translating frame, rotating frame, repeating frame, and these are really, really handy things. Now, in previous classes, we used repeat frame. This is good for especially tiling textures. If I was to replace these numbers, for instance, with 4x4, we can see how that affects things. It repeats a texture that number of times across the object. But let's ignore that for now and just reset that back to 1. What I want to do instead is, with this selected, I want to open up my channel box. And my channel box should now have a list of things that show up, such as such as the information for moving this object. In this case, it is not. So we can see that it is still showing us just the polygon sphere information, which means that I can't do anything. So I'm going to make things nice and simple here and go to Windows, Rendering Editors, and I'm going to open up the Hypershade. Okay, now with the Hypershade open, I can see a list of the materials that are in this scene. Now, that's probably a little bit busier than you thought it might be. Now, the easiest way to do this is to simply click this icon here, which is Material Test, which is obviously the one I just made. And then I'm over here, just above my graph editor, I'm just going to click this little button which says Input Connections, which will just show me the graph, the very basic graph for this material. And of course, I can see that material over here. Now, the node that I care about in this particular case is this one over here. So if I scroll over to it, I'm going to go full screen here just so you can actually see what I'm looking at, and then tap F. And you actually see this is a visual breakdown of how this texture is made up. And this is just another way of looking at the same information. And of course, Maya has, obviously it has lots of different windows, but it always has loads of different ways of looking at the same information. So here we can see how this texture is built. It has placement details, and those placement details tell this water pattern where they should be. And of course then there are other things such as ambient color, incandescent, so that is the Lambert properties. So in total that builds that material that we see over here. Now I actually just need to select this place 2D texture node for now, and of course I can see those properties opening up, so I'm just going to select that. Now currently I don't really need to see any of this, I just need to move this out of the way. But here on my very right hand side I can see I now have access to a bunch of other bits of channel information. And the one that I'm really interested in, of course in this particular instance, is translate frame U or translate frame V. This is excellent. So now I can play around with things and see how things go, okay? So I'm going to close this window because this is all I need to see. Now, in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to worry about this. Translate frame on the U. So okay, over down here, I'm going to my timeline and I'm going to press, I'm not going to press anything. I'm going to right click on Translate Frame U and I'm going to go Key Selected. And I can see now in my timeline, let's just make this a bit bigger so you can see, it's not going to let me, typical. But I can see there's a keyframe now there, and of course I get a little signal that there's a keyframe there. And then I'm going to move all the way over to frame 200 and I'm going to put in, let's say number 2 to be nice and obvious. And then I'm going to right click again and Key Selected. So Maya now believes that between frame 1 and between frame 200, this goes from 0 to 2. And what does that look like? And we can see that that is rotating this horizontally, which is of course U on the UV coordinates. This is great news. But actually, it's not what I wanted. I wanted the V. So of course, if you ever make that mistake, it's easy enough to undo. We can just right click where those keys are and we can hit delete. And the same over here. Right click, delete. I didn't want that to happen. So I'm going to go and I want translate V to happen instead. So I want these coordinates to go from translating V. I'm going to hit right click and key select. Oh, whoop, that was still U. Right click, key selected on V. Then of course by frame 200, I want that to have translated at least 2 times. So there we go, 2. Then I can go right click on V and key selected. And of course Maya now believes this moves back and forward. Now because this doesn't deal with minus numbers, I have a small irritation here, is that this is now moving up. I'd like it to move down. There are 2 things I can do to solve this particular problem. Number 1 is I can rotate the object, and I'm holding J to rotate this, so that it's 90 degrees round, and I still get my result. So this object is now essentially upside down, and of course I'm now getting this nice texture moving across it. Or of course I can simply rotate it, so I go back to where it was, J to constrain rotation. So we know that this is going the wrong direction, is that I can also rotate that in the UV editor. So if I go to UV editor, grab those UVs as they are, hold right click, select all those UVs, holding J, I can rotate those instead. And of course, that hopefully means that by the time I look over here, I'm getting exactly what I want. So there's like essentially 3 ways of doing the same thing. Go to object mode. So ultimately, I'm getting the result that I want. I now have this rotating texture. And don't worry about that seam. It's previs level graphics. I don't really mind that sort of thing. But I've got one problem. This is taking between 1 sec. If we think about it this way, we have 200 frames. So, just around about 8 seconds or so. And we notice that this also has an ease in effect. So it's slow to start with. And then, of course, it gets into full speed. And then, of course, towards the end, it begins to obviously ease off a little bit. And you'll see that slow right down. Now that is where we want to deal with the graph editor. So one thing we do know about this texture is that I kind of probably want this sort of thing to infinitely loop, but I also don't want that ease in, ease out effect, because I want it to be a constant stream. And of course, for things like water, waterfalls, or surfaces, that's exactly what we're looking for. So now we're going to have to deal with the graph editor. So I'm going to go to Windows, I'm going to go to Animation Editors and Graph Editor. Bring this up, and I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so that we can see it. Now, of course, the object isn't selected yet, but if I give that a wee click, and then obviously I want to go to Polysphere and open that up a little bit. Now, you'll notice that right away, there's nothing there. There's nothing to animate. So, of course, we're going to have to go back and make sure that we've selected that node correctly. Sometimes you can simply do that by going to Properties and heading over here, but you notice that still we're not getting any options here. So what we want to do instead is, of course, make sure that we selected the right node again. And irritatingly, that means we have to go to Windows, Rendering Editors, and Hypershade. It's window after window here. And of course, here I can see that the Place Texture node is still here. So by clicking that, I can see that it has an animation information in there. So I'm just going to close this. I don't need it anymore. Oh no, I've closed both by accident. My apologies, friends. Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. So it's still selected, thank goodness. But here I can see that that is the edited UV. So there's a couple of things I can do here now to fix this. I want to select this first of all here. And of course, I can see that this has like an ease in and an ease out, these lovely curves here. Now I could manually straighten those, or I could click this handy little matchstick icon here, which is called linear tangent. And if I click that, it will straighten this out. And of course, when I play, this will now travel at one constant speed rather than easing in and easing out, which is great news. And of course, I'll hit stop, rewind to the front. And the next thing I want to do is I probably want to add, which is a post-infinity and a pre-infinity and a post-infinity, which means that I want this texture to repeat forever in the manner that it's already doing. And of course you can see here that there are a couple of these squiggly little icons. They're not very large. They're a little bit difficult to see, but you can see that there is one in particular which is called pre-infinity cycle with offset, and of course there is a post-infinity with offset. Now both of those are actually just as useful as each other. So if I was to click this and hit, let's say, well, I just go with this, our pre-infinity, and then of course afterwards we're going to click post-infinity, and you'll notice now that the lines before and after our animation have now been made infinite. So if I scroll out, no matter how far I go, this is an infinite loop now. So I'm going to zoom back in. My animation means that no matter how long my animation gets, these 200 frames will repeat forever, which is great news. So let's give that a close, and we'll give this a play. And of course that looks tremendous. Nothing particularly fancy, and of course there's all sorts of other things we can do to enhance this this animation further. For instance, in this case, I just have one single color file attached. I haven't animated or added any transparency. I haven't added any incandescence. And incandescence is fun for adding like other things, like obviously being a surface, it probably has some sort of light qualities, and of course the ambient color as well. You might want to bring that out. That's up to you, of course. These are your choices. Big thing I love to do, though, of course, is add something like a bump map, and add just something that kind of breaks up that texture a little bit, say using like a fractal. And of course I can play around with how bumpy this really is. So you can see there's some results there. I tend to keep things reasonably light touch, of course. And of course, it's once I've got something that resembles a reasonable result, I can see there's some bumpiness in there. I can head over to the fractal and begin playing around with some of those shapes, getting something that's a bit warbly and warpy, just to help break that surface up a little bit further. Nothing too fancy, of course. Must always be conservative when it comes to these choices. careful, does it? And of course we can see we're getting some nice texture there. Now I don't want it looking too rocky either. It's just something that just adds a little bit more definition. And of course, a texture will, of course, it will keep running, but it is running underneath that bump map. So the bump map isn't animated, but it just helps break that surface up and make it look a little bit better. Now, of course, if this was a blend texture and was a little bit shinier, things would be very different, and of course we would have this a sense of shimmering. So in any case though, that's how to create a animated texture using UV coordinates. It's a reasonably simple method, and of course you can use this in many circumstances. I hope that was useful. I will catch you another time, and perhaps maybe we can take this into an advanced stage next. So hope that was useful. Good luck with your projects, and I'll see you soon.